We are very lucky to have Jesse Spafford here with us. If you want to say a little bit about who you are, the sort of work you do, and then maybe we'll sort of introduce the book that we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Luke. Yes, so I'm Jesse Spafford. I'm currently a senior lecturer at Te Herangawaka, the Victoria University of Wellington, down here in Wellington, New Zealand. And I'm a philosopher here. I do primarily political philosophy, also moral philosophy and the intersection between the two. And my primary research interests are I'm interested in debates between libertarians, socialists, and anarchists over the moral status of the market and the state. So that's my primary area of interest, and I kind of try to weigh in, usually in favor of the anarchists. So I've recently written a book called Social Anarchism and the Rejection of Moral Tyranny, and that aims to try to present what I take to be the moral core of anarchism, but kind of presenting it in the terms of modern contemporary analytic philosophies, sort of trying to use the technical tools that philosophers have developed over the last 50 years and apply them to give a fairly detailed exposition of what I think anarchists sort of should think and really what everyone should think. So I'm trying to defend the position and defend it against various interlocutors, particularly libertarians, and try to win over these other people. And maybe they're skeptical of anarchism and try to show, actually, there's a pretty compelling moral theory here for people who accept a wide array of different philosophical positions. It's kind of my primary angle.
So the book then came out in 2023. Just as a preliminary, I guess. How are you still pretty happy? To defend pretty much the basic thesis of the book. I take it that very broad picture. There's kind of four commit or five, I suppose, commitments that are, I think, supposed to be joined under a big kind of moral principle that we'll get to. But that's kind of the basic core. Is we have these five commitments, and they're sort of under this umbrella of this single, plausible kind of moral constraint, and that's the core of the book that we're talking about, social anarchism and the rejection of moral tyranny. Is have your thoughts, I guess, sort of evolved in any way, or is it still like, no, I think I got it pretty much right in 2023?
It's a good question. Yeah, I would say that I haven't really departed too much from the core views. There may be some like minor bits of the sub-arguments that I would do a little bit differently if I were to go back. But in terms of the actual core position defended, no, I'd say I'm pretty much still, I haven't yet encountered anything that would make me change my mind. Yeah, so I would still say I'm a proponent of the material in the book as it appears. Yeah, so happy to do my best to continue to try and to defend it here in this conversation.
Perfect. Um, let's maybe lay out then what this position is. So I take it that the position is a social anarchist one, more or less. For what it's worth, there's a preface in the book where you're kind of trying to sort out what that even means, because the term anarchist is sort of up in the air for a lot of different camps. You could be like an anarchist capitalist, right? I mean, what even is an anarchist? And the basic idea is that when we think about social anarchism, if everyone was sort of sufficiently aware and sort of in a state of reflective equilibrium about the anarchist position, it would be basically the one laid out in the book. So that's sort of what we're trying to get at when we're talking about social anarchism. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Because, right, there's so many people who call themselves anarchists, and they're going to have a lot of different views about almost everything. I mean, even among people who, right, as you noted, there's many different sort of subgroups of anarchists. Self-described social anarchists, individualist anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, mutualists. Like, there's lots of different camps there, all of whom, claim to be anarchists, and there's sort of a question of, well, what is anarchism? If there's all this internal disagreement. And there's going to be a lot of internal disagreement even within any of those camps, right? If you call yourself an anarcho-communist, well, lots of people do that. But if you went out and I think interviewed them, you'd still find many points of disagreement about core questions. So it does make it a little hard to say, oh, well, here's just what social anarchism is, right? Here's what anarcho-communism is, etc. So I try to be a little bit more modest in one sense, in that I'm trying not to say, oh, I've got the official take, the authoritative declaration of what social anarchism is. But on the other hand, yeah, my suggestion is I'm like, yeah, I do think that of the people who call themselves social anarchists, left-wing egalitarian anarchists, I think this is the position they would converge upon, as you said, in a state of reflective equilibrium. So it's it's not necessarily the position that anarchists endorse, but it's the position that I think they would endorse or should endorse at the very least, is how I'd frame it.
Right. So let's start digging in a little bit then into what the social anarchist position is committed to. So maybe we just roll through very quickly one at a time. So um, the first commitment is supposed to be this consent theory of legitimacy. What is that?
Yeah, great. So the consent theory of legitimacy, I think, is probably the least controversial of the sort of planks of the anarchist platform, at least among anarchists. And basically, what this theory holds is it gives the sort of the necessary and sufficient conditions of you having what's been called political obligations, or the state being legitimate. And the idea here is that a legitimate state is one that has the moral power to oblige you by passing laws. So the thought is if a state's legitimate, then that means that when it issues a law, you're now obligated to comply with that law simply because it's a law, right? So if the state passes a law that says, everybody has to wear red shirts every Friday, well, now you actually have a moral obligation to follow that law. You have a duty to do that. You act wrongly. If you don't do that, you wrong the state. Specifically, you have a duty to the state to wear a red shirt on Fridays. And so it's this sort of content-independent obligation that I think most non-anarchists think people have. So people think that states are legitimate in this way. They think they have this power of legitimacy. So, you come to a red light in the middle of the night, nobody's around. Many people think, yeah, you've got a duty to stop at the red light because that's the law. Even if you know that you're not going to hurt anybody if you run the red light. Right, so that's what it means for a state to be legitimate. But then there's sort of a question of, well, how is it that states come to be legitimate in this way, right? What would give somebody this kind of power to oblige? Because in some sense, it's a little bit of an odd power, right? Like it's not one that we think most people have, right? If, I just sort of said to you right now, I command you to do 30 push-ups, right? The thought would be, well, do you now have a moral obligation to do 30 push-ups? Clearly not. I think everybody would agree about this. So then there's sort of a puzzle about, well, why is it that the state seemingly has this power, or many people believe it has this power, and why don't you? Or why don't I? And so that's what different theories of legitimacy that's the question they attempt to answer is, well, what conditions have to be met for some entity like the state to be legitimate in this way, to have this power to oblige? And basically, the suggestion here is the consent theory that consent theorists propose. They say, in order to get this power, you have to get the consent of the governed, right? People are only obliged to comply with your edicts, to obey your laws, if they've actually consented to do so in some relevant sense. Which, you can just sort of draw from this, consider interpersonal examples, right? So if I were to say to you, do 30 push-ups right now, I command you, and I say, now you actually have a moral duty to do 30 push-ups. You might say, no, I don't. I never agreed to that, right? Why would I have a moral duty? I think that's a natural response. But I also think it's a natural response that reveals something significant, right? Which is that sort of implied in that response is, oh, well, had I consented, right? If I agreed to it, if I made a contract with you that said, oh, I'll do whatever you say, and then I say, oh, yeah, do 30 push-ups, then actually you would have an obligation to do those push-ups. If you'd promised me that you'd do whatever I'd say, then, and I say, do 30 push-ups, well, then now all of a sudden my edict has moral force. I now have the moral power to oblige you. So it seems like consent is a sufficient condition of making somebody legitimate. If you consent to somebody to being bound by somebody's edicts, well, now you're bound. But at the same time, it also seems like if you don't consent, well, now you're not bound in this way. So the thought, and that's what a consent theorist of legitimacy affirms, right? They say, yeah, if you consent, you're obliged to comply with the edicts of whoever you consent to. Uh, if you don't consent to obeying their edicts, well, now their edicts don't have any moral weight. Right, so that's the theory. And then this is applied to the state. So then the question is, well, is the state actually legitimate? And consent theorists generally say no. There's certain weird exceptions, but for the most part, very few people have actually consented to obeying the state's laws. Very few people have actually explicitly or tacitly agreed to that. There's some debate here, but that's the position that I defend. And so the thought is that actually no existing state is legitimate in the way that many people assume. And this position is often what's called philosophical anarchism. So the philosophical anarchist says, yeah, maybe in theory there could be states that are legitimate. There could be states that you are obliged to obey. If in fact everybody, say in the United States or everybody in New Zealand had, promised to obey the law, well then these respective states might be legitimate. But given that nobody has actually done this, or very few people have actually done this, the states are not legitimate, and so therefore nobody's actually obliged to obey the laws, or at least nobody who hasn't consented. So that's, the consent theory of legitimacy and the philosophical anarchist position that sort of follows from it.
So I think we'll start poking at all of this a bit later, but just trying to draw an implication. Usually, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say like anarchists on the street. I don't know. They are sort of in principle kind of anti-statist, right? But the position on offer here says that's not right. In principle, we could have a perfectly legitimate state. It just has not happened.
Yeah, good. So this is helpful because there's sort of maybe two contrasts to draw out here. One contrast is between what we might call sort of a priori and a posteriori anarchism. So the a priori anarchist position says there just could never be a legitimate state. Legitimacy is actually impossible. And I do think probably many anarchists on the street would say that. Right. Well, I'm defending sort of a weaker a posteriori anarchism where I'm like, well, there could in principle be anarchist states or legitimate states. Just in practice, there are not any because they haven't met this condition. And I think that the a posteriori position is a little bit more plausible, just because I think consent is very powerful. And I think most anarchists should, at the very least, but probably do think that. That, if you consent to something, well, then that's binding. Assuming, your consent is genuine, right? It's informed, what philosophers often call valid consent. Then, you can consent to just about anything, right? I can consent to you, giving me a little pat on the head. I could consent to you killing me. I could consent to giving you my kidneys if I wanted to, right? In some sense, that's, those are all things that I can do. They're all rights I can waive. So similarly, why can't I promise you that I'll just do whatever, you tell me to do for the next 20 years, right? It seems like there's no reason, in my view, in principle, why I couldn't make a promise like that. And similarly, why I couldn't then make a promise like that to a state entity, right? If I promise the government of the United States that I will obey their laws for the rest of my life, and I do that, I'm fully informed, etc., then I'm like, I don't see then why I would not then have obligations to obey the United States. So I think that that's sort of a pretty plausible position, and to deny it, you kind of have to say that people lack certain important moral powers, like the power to commit themselves via promises, or the power to consent to various forms of treatment, which I don't think anarchists would really want to deny upon reflection. So that's one important distinction to draw. The other important distinction to draw is between what you might call political anarchism and philosophical anarchism, right? So I said, the philosophical anarchist position is just, it's a little bit weaker, right? It just says that you're not obligated to obey the state. The political anarchist position says, in fact, you have obligations to try to get rid of the state, right? So the thought is you actually need to, there's something morally better about a stateless world, so we need to get rid of the state. Right, versus the weaker view of just like, you just don't have to listen to the state. And in the book, I only just sort of defend the weaker view, and I actually push back a little bit against the stronger view for maybe reasons we can talk about a little bit later. But so I only want to defend the weaker sort of philosophical anarchism here. So what we might call weaker, a posteriori philosophical anarchism.
Right. Okay. So commitment number one, the consent theory of legitimacy. the second commitment here is um, something called the Lockean Proviso. So there's a kind of classical sort of formulation where what we're concerned with here is appropriation of external resources, basically. And the kind of classic version is you mix your labor, and there's famously some confusion about what that's supposed to mean exactly, but you sort of mix your labor in some relevant way with some external resource, say a piece of land, or I don't know, you to sort of, I don't know, get a sort of intuition pump here, right? You sort of grow some crops, right, on a piece of land. You're sort of mixing your labor in a relevant way with that external resource, right? The land and the crops and so on. The thought is that that's how you appropriate resources, but there's this proviso where you have to leave as much and as good as for everyone else. So what you appropriate can't be so much that you leave. You can't, for instance, to take a rather radical example, you can't appropriate the entire external world and leave everyone else to starve. According to most people, some people think that you can, but most people think this is a pretty reasonable proviso, and you are also endorsing the proviso. Although there's a lot going on with the way that you want to endorse it. So maybe you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, great. So this is probably the most idiosyncratic inclusion within the anarchist sort of position. This is something I definitely don't think most self-described anarchists would endorse, even though it's a pretty plausible view among libertarians, even sort of right-leaning libertarians, for the reasons you discussed, right? So the right libertarians, like, they think that you can turn external resources into private property. But as you noted, they want to put some constraints on this, right? You can't just take the whole world. You have to leave people sort of enough and as good, as John Locke sort of famously declared. With then there being many different interpretations of what it means to leave people with enough and as good. So I actually endorse this aversion of the Lockean proviso, partially for just dialectical reasons, but also partially I think it plausibly follows from some of my other commitments. So I do include it within the anarchist position, even though it's a little idiosyncratic. But I think, as maybe we'll discuss in a little bit, it does some important work and sort of establishes some interesting things that I think many anarchists would find attractive. So I do sort of affirm this idea that you can actually establish private property so long as it meets this condition, so long as you leave others with enough and as good. Okay, so what does it mean to leave people with enough and as good? Well, this has been broadly interpreted within the philosophical condition, within the philosophical tradition, as a non-worsening condition. So the thought being that, what does it mean to leave you with enough and as good? Well, I have to not leave you worse off via my appropriation. So if I claim some patch of land, and I say this is mine now, right? You have to be no worse off than some relevant baseline comparison state. The big question is, well, what's the relevant baseline comparison state? And what I want to say is the relevant comparison is going to be the world where I don't establish, I sort of take a simple baseline for comparison where I'm like, well, it's just the world where I don't try to establish this property, right? So we've sort of compared the world where I establish the property with the world where I don't establish this property. Well, okay, this is where it gets a little bit technical. So let's start with the simple statement, right? So the simple statement is you have to imagine the world where I appropriate the property versus the one where I don't. I complicate this in two ways. The first thing that I want to say is well, actually, when we're asking whether or not I leave you worse off, we can't just ask about whether or not you're left worse off by the establishment of the property. Instead, we have to ask whether or not you'd be left worse off by me establishing the property, and then it's basically anything I subsequently do with it in virtue of having these property rights. So most specifically, I say we have to look at whether or not you'd be left worse off based upon me establishing the property, and then me waiving my claims in various ways, right? So you establish when you establish property, you establish this whole set of property claims against other people, right? So I say, this is my land. That means that now you have a duty not to touch it, not to not to come in contact with the land in any way at any given time. Right? So you might think there's a whole set of ways of using the land that are now denied to you. And what I want to say is okay, but it also has to be the case that I couldn't leave you worse off by selectively waiving those claims and saying, oh, you can actually now come on the land at this given time. And the reason that I include this caveat is because I think that, the property rights should be counterfactually robust, right, is my thought. So my thought is, like, if I genuinely have property rights, I should have those same property rights, no matter how I exercise them. But that means that there can't be sort of certain ways of exercising my property rights, including my power to waive, that leaves people worse off if you take seriously the Lockean proviso, right? So if you think, yeah, seriously, like, property shouldn't leave anybody worse off, it shouldn't be the case that just contingently I don't leave anybody worse off by claiming some bit of land. It has to be the case that, yeah, I claim the land, and then no matter how I exercise those property rights, I'm still precluded from leaving anybody worse off. If it turns out that there's some way that I could use my property that would leave other people worse off, well, then I can't establish that property in the first place, is the idea. And yeah, so maybe an illustration would help here. I sort of give this case where, suppose that there's some single drink, I'm up in the mountains and there's a single spring that functions as the only potable drinking water for, in a big, significant distance. And you're a hiker, and one day, you kind of come marching up and you see this spring and you're hot and sweaty and overworked. And you're like, okay, you know what? I'm going to just like jump in this spring. And you're covered in sunscreen and bug spray and all sorts of chemicals that, as it turns out, will, pollute the water. My thought here is I say, well, suppose that I now say, actually, I've claimed this spring as my own. You can't use it. Well, if I say that, I've clearly left you worse off. Because now you can't use it in any respect, right? You can't swim in it. You can't drink from it. You're sweaty. You're thirsty. Here's this natural resource. I've now denied you the use of it. So you're worse off than you would be had I just, not appropriated this spring in the first place. But we can imagine a world where I do something different. I say, okay, sorry, you're late to arrive. I've claimed this spring. It's mine now. You can't swim in it. But I'll let you drink from it. Just because I'm a nice guy. So, I establish all these claims against you. I claim the spring. I establish all these property rights against you using it. And now I selectively waive one. I say, yeah, you can drink from the spring. You might think that actually now I've in some sense left you better off than you would have otherwise been. You can't swim in the spring like you initially would have, but you weren't thinking ahead, right? You were sort of being reckless. You were just too hot and sweaty. You weren't thinking in the long run. You would have basically poisoned your water supply. And so you're better off not swimming and drinking water later than swimming first and then not being able to drink water later. Right? So that's sort of a thought, and that's sort of a story libertarians could tell about how actually sometimes appropriation can leave other people better off. It's a little bit of an idiosyncratic, whimsical example, right? Often libertarians will give other examples of, say, common pool resources or things that, scarce resources where appropriation actually helps manage the resource and prevent sort of tragedy of the commons type situations, right? So there's a single fishing hole. Everybody wants to come fish in it. They would immediately exhaust the fishing hole. But if I'm able to appropriate it and claim ownership, well, now nobody can fish for free, right? I start charging people access selectively. But the fish stock isn't immediately depleted. It lasts over many years. And actually, maybe everybody ends up better off than if they were able to just freely use the fishing hole, right? That's a sort of story that libertarians can tell about how actually, even though when I seize property, I'm leaving you all worse off in some respect, right? Now you just can't freely use it. But sometimes that actually can leave you better off than you would be under free use because everybody sort of depletes the thing, right? So this sort of swimming case is analogous, right? It's actually by me claiming this thing and excluding you selectively, I'm actually leaving you better off than you would be if you were able to just freely use this resource. But my worry here is I just think, well, sure, in this case, maybe I happened to be a nice guy and waived my claims such that I let you drink the water. But I could equally have just denied you use of the spring altogether. I didn't have to waive that claim, right? It's my, if I have this right, then it should be counterfactually robust. I don't have to exercise my property rights in any particular way. I don't have to necessarily waive a claim. So then the worry is there's another possible world where I could have left you worse off, or right where I could have let you sort of swim in the water and not drink it, or only let you just dip your toes in, poisoning the water, but not let you swim at all. Right? In both those cases, you would be worse off than you would have otherwise been. And so I want to say, given that there's some way that I could use the property, in some way I could exercise the established rights in a way that would leave you worse off, then actually I'm not able to appropriate the spring at all under my interpretation of the Lockean proviso, right? So I say, yeah, the appropriation, it can't leave you worse off on its own, and also there can't be some way of me exercising my rights that leaves you worse off, right? No matter how I exercise my rights, you can't be left worse off, is the idea. Yeah, and is that suitably clear?
Yeah. So I think this is actually just going to lead into I think the fourth commitment of the position basically just follows from this. Let me make sure that I've actually not messed this up. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah, no, you're right.
the fourth thing is just that basically you just can't come to own external resources. So the second commitment, this proviso, basically just brings us into another commitment of the position, pretty close anyway.
Yeah, you're right. I jumped ahead a little bit, but hopefully this discussion sort of foregrounds how, I've sort of presented the Lockean proviso, but it turns out it's pretty strict in that it precludes almost all appropriation. Yeah, for the reasons, you're sort of hinting at here, which is that, yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, when you appropriate something, it just generally leaves people worse off, right? If I appropriate some beach, right, well, now you can't sit on the beach anymore, and that's a worsening, right? There's some ways of using, granted, there's some ways of appropriating things and exercising the rights that don't leave people worse off, right? There are ways of doing that, but the proviso I endorse is stronger and says, well, yeah, even if there's some way you could use your property that wouldn't leave other people worse off, if there's even a single way that could leave people worse off, you don't get these property rights because property rights are counterfactually robust. Yeah, so not to sort of maybe the point's adequately clear, but take the example again of the fishing stock, right? If I appropriate a fishing hole, and I say, okay, sorry, you all, everybody, you're no longer free to use this fishing hole as you were before. You have to buy fish from me, but I'll sell them to you at sort of a reasonable rate, right? I'll balance conservation, and I'll also, right, I won't overcharge you. I'll charge you a reasonable amount, right? In some sense, I might leave everybody better off than they would have been, say, in the world without appropriation. And many right libertarians then are going to say, yeah, great, that's fine. So you satisfied the Lockean proviso. But I want to say no, because if it's genuinely my fishing pond, I could say, okay, I'll tell you what, I've claimed this, and now just nobody gets to use it. Sorry, you all go hungry. You don't get the free fish anymore. I get the fish, and I'm just going to let them die, right? Or maybe I'll take them and, just eat them all myself, or, whatever. But nonetheless, I would have the moral power and moral rights to sort of, I would have the moral power to exercise these rights however I want, and as a result, could leave everybody worse off. And I think that, the spirit of the Lockean proviso is such that people should not be able to do that. But that means that even acts of appropriation that are in point of fact beneficial for others, that leave nobody worse off and in fact leave people better off, are typically not going to satisfy this proviso, just because those owners could misuse their property if they wanted, and they shouldn't have the moral power to do that.
Right.
Yeah. So as a result, you basically end up with the conclusion, right, which you note is the fourth plank of the anarchist position, which is that, yeah, as it just turns out, if you take the Lockean Proviso seriously and you sort of take the spirit of the Lockean Proviso seriously, you end up in a situation where there's just no established private property, right? Again, it's sort of similar to the posteriori anarchism. In theory, people could come to own things if they could satisfy this proviso, but the proviso is very stringent, I think, for good, and appropriately so. And so then as a result, most attempted acts of appropriation, almost all of them fail to meet the proviso, so they don't succeed. So people don't actually establish private property rights over external objects like, libertarians tend to think they do.
And just as a quick example of what might pass in principle, if somebody lived on the moon and they started doing stuff on the moon and nobody else is there to be left worse off by whatever they're doing, then it seems like that might succeed. But that's not the way things are down here. There's lots of other people that are worsened by whatever it is you're doing because there's just a lot of us. So no acts of appropriation actually succeed, even though they might, on the moon or whatever. That's kind of the jumping off point.
Yeah, exactly right. In a world without scarcity, this proviso could be satisfied, but in a world with scarcity, it's basically never satisfied.
Perfect. So I think we could probably camp out on this for a while, but I take it then that the main point of pushback here is just going to be that perhaps you're taking the spirit a little too seriously. Maybe it's proving too much, if you like, if the conclusion is that nobody can own external resources. I mean, something just has to be going wrong here. The saying, perhaps, one philosopher's modus ponens is another's modus tollens, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's definitely a point people will push back against, particularly libertarians, right? But even people who aren't necessarily libertarians but still think, some establishment of private property rights is possible, are going to think that this conclusion is just sort of, self-evidently absurd. It's a little bit hard to, resolve this kind of impasse, right? When you do have a modus tollens, modus ponens, kind of conflict. So I guess what I would say is I'd say a couple of things. So first, I'd say that I don't think that people who are sympathetic to private property can just sort of take this conclusion as a reductio of the Lockean proviso I endorse, just because, whether or not people have private property is a point of philosophical dispute, right? In some sense, that is one of the defining points of dispute between, say, libertarians and anarcho-capitalists and social anarchists, right? A signature feature of people who consider themselves social anarchists is, very broadly, social anarchists will think, yeah, there's no external private property. So I do think that given that dialectic, and, which is, right, I do think that libertarians or libertarian sympathetic people who want to say, well, if you've got a proviso that precludes the establishment of private property, that goes too far. That means we need to reject your proviso. I do worry that that's a little bit of like pounding the table, right? They're just kind of reasserting their position, when in some sense what they need to defend is that people have private property. And I think that I have a little bit of the dialectical upper hand here, because I can say, well, look, you have this proviso that you accept, you being the right libertarian, many right libertarians accept something like a Lockean proviso. You think private property can't leave people worse off. And I'm just sort of taking that to its logical conclusion. And once we take that to its logical conclusion, it turns out you can't get any private property. And I think that it's a little bit ad hoc to then try to say, now we're just going to reject, we're going to reject our proviso and the thoughts that motivate it because it didn't get us the results we wanted. When the results that they wanted are sort of, that's the point of dispute. So I do think that I'm kind of moving the debate forward a little bit while they're, to sort of claim that this is just a modus tollens and we should reject the proviso because it doesn't get us private property rights. I do think that's much closer to begging the question and much closer to sort of just presupposing what it is they're trying to prove. So I think that's one thing that I would say. Another thing that I would say is that I actually think that my interpretation of the Lockean proviso sort of can be independently motivated. by what in the book I called the moral tyranny constraint, which we'll come to in a little bit. But I'll just flag it now that I have sort of an independent supporting argument for this particular interpretation of the proviso that makes it seem a little bit less ad hoc as well. So that's, I think, what I would say against the sort of complaint that this is, just too strong of a proviso. Yeah.
Right. So that's 3 out of the 5. There's another really big hitter. The third kind of thing that we're concerned with is something called self-ownership. I take it that the basic idea here is pretty straightforward. I mean, if you're a self-owner, you can sort of have claims against other people, say, coming in contact with your body, in the same way that any other piece of property that I have a claim against you just coming and doing it whatever you want. If I own myself as a piece of property, I have those same sorts of claims over my body, and we can sort of start to make sense of certain sort of common sense moral features. So it's often thought like I have a right not to have my kidneys harvested, for instance. Well, what explains that? Well, I'm a self-owner. I have this sort of claim against that sort of thing. Like why can't you just like come up and slap me? Same thing. I take it that it's supposed to be a very intuitive kind of thing, and as philosophers do, it's been problematized a lot. And so part of the way that you want to talk about self-ownership is what's called anarchist self-ownership, which is a little bit weaker. The kind of canonical kind of way of thinking about this says that you just have more or less unlimited claims. The anarchist self-owner has a really specific kind of way of thinking about self-ownership. So maybe you can unpack the way that the social anarchist is kind of thinking about this, as opposed to maybe some of the stronger, more canonical thoughts here.
Yeah, great. So this is, again, slightly idiosyncratic. I think most social anarchists would, or at least many, would be inclined to accept sort of simple self-ownership, the classical conception, as I call it, right? Which is just, as you nicely introduced it, the idea that you just have claims against people making contact with your body. You can waive those claims via consent, but if you don't consent, then people wrong you if they come into contact with you, whether that be by harming you, by punching you, but even, just as Judith Jarvis Thomson gives the example of, her coming up and giving somebody a kiss on the back of the neck. Right? It's like, well, that doesn't really hurt you per se, but it's nonetheless a violation. And the thought might be, well, that's because, we own ourselves. We have claims against people coming into contact with our bodies because we own them. But as you note, I weaken this a little bit. So I want to say that actually your set of claims is a little bit more limited. You have claims against most forms of contact, but there's still a specific subclass of physical contact that you actually don't have claims against on the view that I defend here, what I call anarchist self-ownership. And that is that there's certain times when people might make contact with your body where they do so because they make contact that gives them special supplemental benefit beyond, right? So sometimes people make contact with your body and they benefit because of the contact they make with your body, right? So, if Judith Jarvis Thomson comes up and gives me a little kiss and she gets a thrill from it, right? That's a benefit she gets from making contact with my body, but it's not what I would call a supplemental benefit, right? So supplemental benefit is all the benefits that come not from making the actual contact itself, right? They're benefits that come sort of from something else where making contact is sort of incidental to achieving those other benefits. So to use an example I deploy elsewhere in the book, right? Suppose that you're in a building that's on fire and you're trying to escape, and I'm standing in the doorway just blocking you, right? Well, you come and I'm just not moving. Well, to get out of the building and not get burnt by the fire, you say you push past me, right? You shove me out of the way and move past. In that case, I want to say you've made contact with my body in a way that gets you a supplemental benefit, right? Because you do benefit from touching my body. If you were precluded from touching my body, right, you would be stuck in the building and you would die in the fire. By touching my body, you're able to get out, you're able to sort of survive, you get significant benefit as a result. Right? That's what I want to call supplemental benefit, right? And I think a useful way of thinking about that is you can think of supplemental benefits as being those benefits that you would have been able to get had my body just like not even been there in the first place, right? If I just like hadn't even been in the doorway, you would have been able to just run out unimpeded. That's the benefit you're able to get. In some sense, my body just gets in the way of you achieving that benefit. And what I want to say is, I want to exclude those kinds of contact that lets you achieve supplemental benefit from the scope, from the set of actions that self-ownership precludes, right? So self-ownership says you can't make contact with me generally, but you can make contact with me if doing so lets you achieve supplemental benefit. Or more specifically, if doing so uniquely lets you achieve supplemental benefit, attain these supplemental benefits, right? So suppose you're in the burning house and you could either push past me, but suppose there's another door, right next to me that you could equally go through. Well, now you don't need to make contact with my body to get that same benefit, right? To attain that same benefit of escaping the fire. So in that case, according to the anarchist self-ownership principle that I defend, right, you actually could not push me now. You can't now push me because there's an alternative way of attaining the same benefits equally that doesn't involve making contact with my body, right? So in that case, I still have a claim against you making contact. It's just in those cases where the only way for you to get this benefit is by making contact with my body, the supplemental benefit. Well, in those cases, I don't actually have a claim against you making contact with my body. You can't kiss me on the back of the neck for sexual pleasure or non-sexual pleasure, whatever, but you can push me out of the way to get out of a burning building. So that's the weaker notion. And yeah, I can talk a little bit about the motivations here, but maybe I'll pause for a second to see if that's you have anything you want to add or jump in.
Well, yeah, I was actually going to go exactly where you were, which I take it that this is not an arbitrary addition. So when you think about I'm going to call it like the unlimited claims view. I don't know if that's right exactly, but near enough for our purposes. The kind of really strong versions of self-ownership where you just have sort of, very strong claims against any kind of contact just turn out to be really, really strong. So, if you like walk into the same room as me, your body has now like made photons sort of do a certain thing that interacts with my eyes. And apparently I have a claim against you doing that because you have now somehow like made contact with my body. Or if you like run a factory or whatever, and the smoke particles from your factory make contact with my skin, I now have a claim against that. Apparently it's very, very strong if we don't make the relevant sort of addition here, because if we think about supplemental benefit, right? If I'm, running my factory, or you're running your factory, whatever I said, we're getting supplemental benefit I assume that if we're running a factory, I'm not doing it to make the smoke, make contact with you. I'm doing it for some other reason. So the point here is to try and get around, the very strange implications of the really strong, sort of notion of self-ownership.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, by weakening it in this way, you just avoid a lot of these problem cases. Like, yeah, as you noted, pretty much everything would be ruled out, right? You couldn't have factories, but also presumably, you couldn't fly airplanes because airplanes, sort of spray a fine layer of particles over all of our bodies. The noise from them jiggles our eardrums in ways, and it doesn't seem like you can really get around this because, seemingly the only thing the person who believes in sort of classical full self-ownership could say is, well, in these cases, you're just bombarding me with photons or, CO2 or vibrating the air. You're not actually sort of physically making contact with me in the way that you would if you, say, like came up and punched me or kissed me on the neck, right? But it seems pretty clear that if I shoot somebody with a gun, I've infringed their self-ownership. Even though I haven't touched them, right? My body never touches them. I just bombard them with something. So it seems like, self-ownership has to give you claims against bombardment. But once you have claims against bombardment, well, now everything basically bombards other people. So it just seems like almost all human activity becomes a rights violation if you accept full self-ownership. And, another way of trying to get out of this is you say, well, the sort of bombardment, well, a lot of these bombardments aren't particularly harmful, right? When an airplane flies overhead, it's not like it's actually hurting me when it jiggles my eardrums and, puts a very fine coating of, CO2 or whatever else is coming out of the exhaust system on my body, right? So it's harmless. But again, if you believe in self-ownership, you don't want to say that you only have claims against harmful physical contact, right? Because then, that comes back to Judith Jarvis Thompson's kiss on the back of the neck case, right? Yeah, there's lots of ways that people can sort of touch you and manipulate your body and bombard you that aren't necessarily harmful, but we still want to say you have claims against. So, sort of, I don't think there's an obvious way of getting out of this problem, this sort of pollution problem. But I think my proposed weakening of the anarchist self-ownership, of the self-ownership principle, or self-ownership thesis, such that it becomes this anarchist self-ownership thesis, I think does a pretty good job of doing this. It's like, yeah, because, all these sort of polluting activities, like all the sort of paradigmatic pollution problems of, you walking in the room and bombarding me with photons, or me starting a factory and, a little bit of smoke sort of drifting over and touching your body, right? In all these cases, yeah, you're doing them to, attain some sort of other benefit, right? I'm running the factory so that I can make the things that I need to survive. And this is, the only way that I can sort of get these things is by doing some kind of economic activity that's going to sort of, impact somebody's body. So it seems like, there's this benefit that this will uniquely get me. So therefore, I want to say, yeah, you don't actually have a claim, or, you don't have a claim against me running this factory. I keep switching back and forth who's the factory owner and who isn't, but
I did the same thing.
Yeah, it's a little hard to keep straight, but yeah. So that's a big theoretical advantage of this weakening. But I also want to say something stronger as well. So, which is that not only does this sort of weaker self-ownership thesis, not only does it solve this pollution problem, but I also think there's sort of further theoretical reasons for accepting it and thinking that it's a principled move, not just sort of an ad hoc way of patching a theory. So I can maybe talk about that in a little bit, but maybe we can come back to that and talk about the fifth plank. I don't know how.
Yeah, I take it that there's kind of one last thing in the overall position, and then you've referenced it a couple of times. There's this kind of big meta principle that ties all of this together. So let's cover the.
Well, but maybe before getting to that, though, it maybe is worth talking about the Luck egalitarian distributive claims. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, right. Let's sort of flesh out the fifth kind of thing here first. Yeah, exactly. So in introducing Luck egalitarianism, then I mean the roughly the idea is just going to be that inequalities are sort of just to the extent that they are reflecting a sort of sanctionable choice, which is something I think we'll have to sort of lay out what that means. But just to sort of intuition pump people, G.A. Cohen had this example of the ants and the grasshopper, right? So it's the ant that works hard and the grasshopper that does nothing, right? The ants sort of work really hard and they store a bunch of food for the winter. And the grasshopper, he does nothing, right? He spends his summer doing absolutely nothing, has no food. And then he goes and begs the ants for food. And it seems a little bit objectionable that he made this choice to do nothing and waste his time and have nothing stored up. It seems like the inequalities that result from that are, a reflection of, sanctionable choices that were made. And that's the sort of inequality that Luck egalitarians are okay with. That's sort of roughly the picture. Maybe you can take it from there.
Yeah, that's great. But then the flip side is also going to be that any sorts of other inequalities are going to be unjust, right? So the thought is, if you make some sort of sanctionable choice, which again we'll talk about, but hopefully, that case gives you sort of an intuitive sense of what a sanctionable choice looks like, right? It's like, if I just sort of spend all my time like hanging out, lounging while other people are working hard, and then I say, oh no, now it turns out I'm actually worse off than you all because I'm about to starve to death, or just go hungry. It seems like I don't have a strong claim of justice that you redistribute to me. Uh, and so it seems like actually, if an inequality then arises between lazy me and everybody else who's hardworking, well, I kind of brought that on myself. Some might say that's not quite the way I would want to frame it, but that's sort of the intuition, right? Is certain choices are going to justify inequality, such that nobody else has any kind of duty of justice to be like, oh, I guess I have to compensate you. Like you made this choice. Like, sorry, it's basically, that's sort of the tough line of luck egalitarianism. But then the flip side, the sort of softer flip side is it says, well, yeah, but every other sort of inequality is actually unjust, right? So, G.A. Cohen again does a nice job, I think, of laying out the kinds of inequalities that, we might think of as unjust because they're not due to sanctionable choice. They're just sort of due to luck, right? So, for example, he says, take racial discrimination, right? Suppose that you grow up in a society where people just treat you badly because of your race or your caste, right? You end up living a worse life than everybody else, but that's through no fault of your own, right? It's not like you did anything that would justify this inequality, right? It's just you were unlucky in terms of being born with the wrong color of skin. And it seems like that inequality is unjust. Why? Because it's arbitrary, right? It doesn't correspond to the right sort of choice. Similarly, right, suppose that, you're born into a very wealthy family who invest tons of money in you, going to computer science summer camp every summer, right? And then as a result, you end up very well off. And meanwhile, I grew up in an abusive family where, there's no resources and it's very unstable and I'm constantly mistreated. I don't even, maybe they don't ever even send me to school. I don't learn any skills. There was another philosopher I was talking with who, he was like, yeah, my parents basically only gave me Mountain Dew from my whole childhood, and so I had to get all my teeth replaced and have all these dental problems, right? And it's like, yeah, if that happens to you, that generates inequality, and again, it seems like that's unfair and unjust, again because it doesn't seem to correspond to choice. And then finally, Cohen, he pushes it even a little further and says, well, yeah, similarly, the same thing goes for, suppose that you're just born with a serious disability, that you are born with chronic pain, or you're born blind such that you're not able to compete in a market economy as well as sighted people, or pick your disability of choice, right? But again, it seems like, well, that's just all of these things seem of a kind, right? They all seem like just examples of bad luck, right? You shouldn't end up worse off than somebody else because you have a particular skin color, because your parents were a particular way, or because of a particular genetic endowment that you happen to have or lack. Right? All of these seem sort of morally arbitrary, unable to adequately justify inequality. Right? By contrast, it seems like certain sorts of choices can justify inequality. And so luck egalitarianism generalizes this thought and says, yeah, inequality is just if and only if it corresponds to some sort of sanctionable choice. Right? Whatever, again, being a little vague here, but certain choices can justify inequality. So yeah, so that's the sort of classic luck egalitarian position. The position that I sort of defend is I basically present this as a rights-based view. So I sort of take the classical luck egalitarian view, and I want to say, well, we should think of this in terms of rights. So what I want to say is I say, on my telling, right, we actually all start out with luck egalitarian rights over the Earth's natural resources, which is just to say that you have the rights that would correspond to the prescriptions of a luck egalitarian principle of justice. So what that might mean is, I sort of spell it out a little bit in the book, is I say, yeah, to have these kind of luck egalitarian right is to say that I would say have a right against you using resources in a way that would leave me worse off than others, absent some relevant sanctionable choice on my part that would justify that inequality. Right, so if I have a significant disability and then you use resources, you go off and live high and leave me behind to suffer, well, you'd be using those resources in an egalitarian way. I would have a right against you using those resources in that way. So that's kind of how I set things out. Now there's sort of a question of, well, how does this interact with, say, the Lockean Proviso? Well, what I want to say is, I want to say that basically my model is everybody starts out with these luck egalitarian claims. They can, in theory, be superseded by the establishment of private property. So again, in theory, right, everybody starts off with, claims over the moon. If you were able to get up to the moon, you're the only person who's able to access it, ever, for whatever reason, right? And you claim the moon, well, now you actually sort of dissolve everybody's egalitarian claim rights vis-a-vis the moon. And you establish your own private property rights over the moon, right? Because by hypothesis, your appropriation satisfies the Lockean Proviso. It's yours now. We all lose our egalitarian claims. You gain private property claims over it, if you're able to satisfy the Lockean Proviso. So it's sort of a supersession model, right? We sort of start out with egalitarian claims that can be displaced by private property under the right circumstances. And so that's kind of the big picture. Yeah.
Perfect. So, those are, at first glance, sort of five independent sort of commitments of the social anarchist. But you think that it turns out that there is a sort of logical, well, granted that you accept the moral tyranny constraint, but it turns out that there's this kind of logical commitment between a lot of these things, not all of them necessarily, but a lot of what's going on here in terms of this moral tyranny constraint. So when we're thinking about, what it even is, to have a case of moral tyranny, in the book you give the example of, Jason Brennan talking about democracy, how the majority can kind of arbitrarily impose costs upon a minority. Moral tyranny ultimately amounts to sort of leaving people worse off, sort of on purpose, and given that you have other options. There's some technical specifications here, but the gist is just that it's going to be a case of moral tyranny if you sort of leave someone else worse off, sort of on purpose, and given that you had other options. So, the democracy case where the majority might be able to impose costs on a minority, or it's a sort of frequent complaint where, maybe, I have to, like, in sort of contemporary American discourse, right? It's a sort of complaint where, why do I have to pay for your healthcare or whatever, right? When we're talking about universal healthcare, you're sort of, imposing a cost on me, I suppose. The thought is that I have to pay for your healthcare. You're imposing a cost on me, right? And so there's kind of this big meta principle that says any kind of adequate moral theory is not going to allow acts of moral tyranny, and we can use this meta principle to sort of tie a lot of what we've sort of established here together in a kind of nice little way. I'm not sure I did the best job of starting that, but
No, no,
I'll toss it over to you.
no. I think that's pretty good. Yeah, I would say I wouldn't quite necessarily put it. I don't think I necessarily put it in terms of acts of moral tyranny, because in some sense I do want the moral tyranny constraint to be somewhat neutral about particular acts, and more for it just to make a judgment about theories holistically. So, but I think the gist is absolutely right, which is the thought is that, yeah, say you're giving a holistic moral theory, right, a complete theory of which rights and duties people have. Well, on my view, it shouldn't be the case that that theory allows some people to leave other people worse off under conditions of full compliance, at least doing so sort of, in a way that's foreseeable to them, unilateral and discretionary. So there's some technical terms there. We can maybe get into it. That's maybe a little bit less important, but the idea is that, people shouldn't be able to wantonly make choices that will leave other people worse off if everybody complies with the moral theory. So I think maybe the thing that would be most helpful is to animate this a little bit by talking about luck egalitarianism, because that's kind of where this constraint sort of initially, emerged from. Is I think that it's the intuition that I think is really underlying luck egalitarianism, right? So we've talked about luck egalitarianism, right? Luck egalitarianism naturally contrasts with just strict egalitarianism, right? So, a strict egalitarian has a simpler view, right? They just say, well, look, equality is just, inequality is unjust, and that's that, right? Justice requires remedying inequality and turning it into equality, right? And then luck egalitarianism backs away from that, says, okay, actually, we're going to weaken strict equality a little bit, right? Actually, some inequality is just, right? Certain cases, right? Those that correspond to sanctionable choice. Well, why make this weakening? In my view, it's because it's going to handle certain cases, right? So the one that I offer in the book is the case of the spiteful destroyer, right? So here's somebody who, just imagine somebody who just sort of wantonly and mean-spiritedly destroys everything she's given, right? So she just burns down her house, you give her a car, she sets that on fire too, like just smashes it up, and makes her life really bad as a result, right? Because she's just destroying all of her resources. So you kind of can imagine, right? Everybody starts off with, suppose equal shares, and she just destroys hers. Well, what do you do if you're a strict egalitarian? Seems like you're going to have to say, well, I guess justice requires us all giving her more stuff, right? We all have to take, a fraction of our stuff and give it to her such that we're all equal, right? If there's 10 of us, each of us has to take, 1/9 of our stuff and give it to her. Is that right? Would it be 1/10? Anyway, 1/9, I think. Anyway, right, we all have to take a fraction of our stuff, give it to her, and then suppose she just does it again, right? She just destroys it again. And now it iterates, right? And it seems like the strict egalitarian is committed to saying, you just have to keep giving her stuff until everybody's level of advantage is lowered down to, basically zero. And that's what justice requires, which just seems absurd. I think that's a truly intolerable conclusion for any moral theory. And my sort of diagnosis here is I say, yeah, here's what's gone wrong in that case, right? Is it seems like what's so objectionable about this is that everybody's sort of well-being is sort of at the mercy of this person, right? She can lower all of our well-being to zero through her discretionary choices. If she's responsible under a strict egalitarian regime, right, well, then we're fine. But if she just chooses to destroy her stuff, she can leave us all much worse off. So what I want to say is strict egalitarianism sort of gives her this moral power to really worsen our situations. And an adequate moral theory shouldn't do that. Now, notice this is sort of an assessment of moral theories versus actions, right? Because in practice, right, she might destroy all of her stuff and nobody gives her anything, right? She might not actually have the actual power to worsen anybody's position. But the moral theory would give her this power if everybody complied with it. And that's what a moral theory shouldn't allow. So that's what I say, so like egalitarianism sort of, my suggestion is the reason this is such a comparatively attractive position is because it satisfies the moral tyranny constraint, right? Strict egalitarianism allows for moral tyranny. It allows people to just destroy their stuff and leave everybody worse off as a result. Like egalitarianism says, no, sorry, if you destroy your stuff, that's a sanctionable choice, and now the inequality is just, so nobody has to redistribute to you, right? So it precludes people from being able to sort of just wantonly make choices that leave everybody else worse off, right? So that's sort of the meta principles. I'm like, yeah, no acceptable moral principle should enable people to do that. But then that does lead to some of the other examples you give, right? Which is, I say, well, yeah, but if that's the case, then you're going to get certain other anarchist conclusions out of this as well. So, for example, you'll get the consent theory of legitimacy, right? So suppose that the consent theory of legitimacy weren't true, and suppose that a government was legitimate in virtue of the fact that it's democratic, right? You're a democratic theorist about legitimacy, right? That's a different rival moral theory to mine. Right? In that case, you would say, well, yeah, whatever the majority votes for, you now have an obligation to comply with its laws. But now suppose you just have a mean-spirited majority, right? Well, that it's a little close to the real world, right? But there's certainly places, we won't name names, but there's certainly places where people elect leaders who pass laws such that if everybody complied with them, would really negatively impact quite a few people and leave them worse off in ways that they would not otherwise have been. And so the worry is that, a democratic theory of legitimacy suffers from moral tyranny, right? It enables the majority to elect leaders. Basically it's up to the majority, right? They could elect a very good leader. They could pass a very good law that leaves everybody really well off, but they could equally pass a really bad law that obligates everybody to do things that are very destructive. And so it seems like it gives people a lot of discretionary control over the well-being levels of other people. And again, the moral tyranny constraints is, well, that's an inadequate theory of, legitimacy, right? A moral theory can't allow for that kind of discretionary worsening. By contrast, right, a consent theory of legitimacy, well, now the only way that you'll end up with any sort of obligations under that theory is if you consented to them, right? So, granted, you could end up worse off, right? If I promise to do whatever you say, and then you say, okay, well, here's my latest order, right? Slap yourself, and I go, oh shoot, right? And then then I do it. You've left me worse off than I otherwise would have been, but it wasn't unilateral, right? So that's one of the features of the moral tyranny constraint, right? Is that you can't sort of unilaterally and discretionarily leave me worse off, but it wasn't unilateral, right? Like I consented to this, right? I signed on to being left worse off. I could have avoided it, and so the thought is that it seems like in this case, me now having a duty to slap myself isn't problematic in the same way that it would be if 60% of the population passes a law that says, oh, Jesse needs to slap himself. And I go, oh, shoot, right now I have a duty to slap myself. Right? It seems like, well, that's problematic in a way that a consent theory of legitimacy is not. So it seems like the moral tyranny constraint, right, it sort of emerges out of Locke egalitarianism. It does much to explain the motivations of Locke egalitarianism, but also it's going to get you, the consent theory of legitimacy. Right? And seemingly, similarly, right, I think you can get the Lockean proviso out of this as well, right? So again, remember that the Lockean proviso says, well, say you want to appropriate some unowned resource. Well, to do that, right, you can't leave anybody worse off. Well, it seems like that's just a nice sort of implementation of the moral tyranny constraint, right? If you had a different theory of appropriation that wasn't constrained by the Lockean proviso, right? If it was just appropriate whatever you can get your hands on, right? I could, in theory, appropriate the entire world and leave you way worse off than you would have been if I just made a different choice about what to appropriate, right? It gives me a sort of straightforward, non-proviso, no proviso version, what some people call radical right libertarianism, right? Sort of no proviso, a radical right libertarianism gives me a ton of moral discretion. If I'm the first person to arrive, on Earth, I could claim all of it. I could claim none of it and leave it all for you. My choice will significantly affect how well you would end up under conditions of full compliance. And it seems like an adequate moral theory, shouldn't give us that degree of discretion about how well other people's lives go. So it seems like the Lockean proviso sort of keeps me from doing that, right? I can't appropriate anything that would leave you worse off. So that's sort of the thought. So it turns out that, consent theory of legitimacy, the Lockean proviso, right, they're nicely sort of knitted together with Locke egalitarianism, all by this moral tyranny constraint. That's the idea.
Right, and in trying to motivate this, because some of that is just sort of trying to apply dialectical pressure to people who might be sympathetic to right libertarianism. It's like if you accept this moral tyranny constraint, which seems like a lot of them do, the examples you gave in the book are right libertarians complaining about what seem to be violations of the moral tyranny constraint. So if you accept it, turns out you should be a social anarchist. But you do a little bit to try and motivate it to other people too. So one idea is that it's sort of in the same vein as what's called the separateness of persons sort of objection to consequentialism. The thought is, if you're a consequentialist, and I mean, there's a lot to say here too. Obviously, consequentialists are going to want to say their own things, but the basic sort of thought is that consequentialism is, in certain cases, going to give you a license to basically just use other people as long as there's some greater good that comes out of it. The thought is, the separateness of persons thing is just to say that's not how it works. We're all individuals. We have, certain sorts of rights, I guess, that won't allow you to do that. And the moral tyranny constraint sort of seems in line with that, right? The idea is, consequentialism is faulty specifically because it violates the moral tyranny constraint. So people who are sympathetic to this sort of separateness of persons thing should sort of be sympathetic to the moral tyranny constraint. There's a kind of neo-republican version of what it is to be free, where basically it's one way of thinking about it, I guess, is like if you sort of arbitrarily limit my options, that's a problem on the Republican notion of freedom. And it seems like the moral tyranny constraint is basically just saying something weaker than that. You're not allowed to limit my options in a way that would leave me worse off. So people who are sort of sympathetic to the Republican notion should be sympathetic to it. So it sort of seems like there's it seems like a pretty plausible sort of theory is the idea, right? It should appeal to a lot of different people.
Yeah, I think that nicely sums it up, right? Yeah, right. The neo-Republicans, people who are sympathetic to separateness of persons, libertarians. I mean, as you sort of suggested, like, it sounds in a way like sort of, and I start the chapter off with like some examples of, in a way this sounds like a classic libertarian complaint, which is like, yeah, you shouldn't be able to like just leave me worse off by being negligent, right? Like that's a big objection to like, many forms of taxation, right? As libertarians say, oh, so you mean you sort of sit around and don't do anything and don't, sort of take any sort of prudential, don't you act very imprudently, and now I'm supposed to pick up the tab for it with, state redistribution. I don't think so, right? So, and in some sense, the moral tyranny constraint does kind of capture that thought of, right, yeah, you don't, your bad choices, other people, you have to internalize those costs. Other people shouldn't pick up the tab, right? So it captures that sort of libertarian thought, but yeah, it also captures, luck egalitarian thinking, which again is sort of libertarian in this respect anyway. But yeah, right. So I do think that there's many different people to whom this principle should appeal. The moral tyranny constraint, and also I just think that there's a strong then reflective equilibrium case for it. It's like, oh, it's I think significant the fact that it generates all these positions that many people have found attractive. It's like, yeah, the consent theory of legitimacy. Many people find that independently attractive. So if it turns out the moral tyranny constraint implies it, so that's a virtue for the theory. Same with the Lockean Proviso. Again, very widely accepted among libertarians. Well, if it implies that, like that's very attractive. The fact that you should be luck egalitarians rather than strict egalitarians. I mean, I think, basically all egalitarians think this. I don't think there's anybody who's really a strict egalitarian. Pretty much everybody who defends egalitarianism these days is a luck egalitarian of some. Well, I mean, there's other species as well, but I can't think of anybody who's just a strict egalitarian. All the big figures are luck egalitarians. And again, I think that the fact that the moral tyranny constraint sort of, endorses that makes it pretty powerful as well. So, yeah, so I think there's a lot going for it just in terms of reflective equilibrium, as well as it having this dialectical appeal to a lot of different camps. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's worth asking how much time you have at this point. Just trying to lay out, trying to get us to the top of the hill, if you like, to see what the position is, has already taken up near enough an hour and a half. So maybe it's worth asking how much time you have.
I mean, I've got time, but yes, I feel like it's more in terms of making the video a reasonable length. So yeah, let's push on to the key. Maybe like, I don't know, another 45 minutes, and then maybe it can be cut down or something. I don't know. I leave it to your editing, to think about how to make it a watchable thing. But
Yeah.
I'm happy to keep talking. Yeah, why don't we talk for like another 45 minutes, and then I probably should go do other things. But hopefully that would give us enough time to like get to the
So yeah,
everything.
let me just try and poke on
Yeah.
a few things then. So the first thing regarding the consent theory, I guess, is mostly just like a sort of, I don't know, prudential worry, I guess. I mean, what if there just is no like possible world where everyone gets together and agrees? I guess the worry is like, what if it's just not possible to have a legitimate state? Do we just sort of have to make do with, I don't know, some sort of second best? Do we just have to like settle for the democratic theory, or I guess it's just sort of a practical worry about the consent theory?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, how worried about this you are, I think, will depend a lot upon how important you think legitimacy is. So I think for many who are inclined toward philosophical okay, so for some people, I think they do think legitimacy is in some sense a virtue of political systems. It's good if they have it, and so if they can't get it, there's something sort of bad about that. And then yeah, then maybe we need to start looking toward like maybe we should look for a theory of the second best. Like how can they best achieve legitimacy? But in my view, like I don't really think about it that way. I think, especially for those inclined toward philosophical anarchism, it's not so bad if it turns out that states aren't legitimate. And if it turns out they kind of can't be legitimate in practice, like there's just no way to ever get, everybody to consent. That's just impractical. I think the philosophical anarchist is just going to say, yeah, that's fine. Like that's just how things are. And it turns out we're not obligated to obey the state. And right, that's just not a problem. one thing that will maybe motivate this for, viewers who is because I think, you know, you might think, well, why might people worry about this? Like, why might be a worry if we're not obliged to obey the laws? And I think a natural thought is, well, if we don't have any obligations to obey the laws, then like, does that we can just like go around killing other people and like, just doing whatever? Like, it's like the purge all the time, right? Like, it seems like that's really bad. But the philosophical anarchist is going to say, no, 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 you can't do that because there are a bunch of natural duties that you have to people, in some sense like those outlined in my anarchist position, right? So the anarchist is going to say, even if you don't have to obey the laws of the state, but you still can't kill people. Why? Because that violates their anarchist self-ownership rights, right? And similarly, you can't just sort of wantonly, do whatever you want with natural resources because people have egalitarian, luck egalitarian claims against you using them in sort of inequality promoting ways. So in some sense, on the philosophical anarchist, and pretty much all philosophical anarchists are going to have their own, particular view about what natural rights and duties we have. But I think for, pretty much all of them, they're going to think there's a pretty intricate, robust structure of natural rights and duties that already pervade the world before any sort of political obligations come on the scene. So in some sense, like, the fact that such obligations aren't ever going to have the chance to emerge doesn't really leave us impoverished, morally speaking, right? We're still, you still have all the rights and duties one could want, even without this. So the thought is, it's no real drawback if the state isn't legitimate. And it's not even necessarily like a vice of the state, right? It just means that the state doesn't have a particular moral power, right? They can't oblige you, but it could still do lots of other things, right? Like the state could still enact justice, right? You could have, so I mean, this is where things maybe get a little controversial and start to push to the last chapter of my book. But in my view, like, you could have a state that's, right? So basically on the social anarchist position, right? Or on my view, the philosophical anarchist position, the state is basically just like a large armed gang, right? They're no different from the mafia. They're a group of armed people who control certain territory. You don't morally have to listen to them, but maybe prudentially you have to listen to them. But the thought is, well, sometimes gangs can do good things, right? You could, in theory, imagine a perfectly just gang that goes around and strictly enforces the demands of justice. And in some sense, like, if they do that, like, that's fine. And the fact that they're not legitimate, who cares? They're enacting justice. That's great. So so that's sort of what I would say about those who are worried about, who are worried that maybe legitimacy can never be attained. Yeah, I don't think the right move would be to sort of find a fallback theory. But that's maybe a little bit dispositional. I do think maybe some philosophers are inclined to go that way. But I'm a little bit of a modus ponens philosopher. So I'm like, look, the consent theory of legitimacy, that's just the most plausible one given a lot of like the core things we think about legitimacy. So if it turns out that then, no states are legitimate and they never can be, well, that's just how it goes. And it would then be weird to be like, okay, well, let's throw that out and find like a different theory that like gets us the result that states are legitimate. I'm like, that's the wrong way to go about things. You're kind of going, you're going about things backwards. But some philosophers do kind of go that way. So there's a little bit of a modus ponens, modus tollens sort of thing, right? If your starting principle is like, no, the state is legitimate and we have to show why, well then that might give you a reason to reject the consent theory of legitimacy. But I don't think that's a good starting point. But I mean, in some sense, that is the classic one that has animated, a lot of the social contract theorists, like, Hobbes sort of famously is like, his whole point is like, the state is legitimate. Well, I mean, he had a sort of a slightly different conception of legitimacy, but it's like, I'm going to try to prove why, right? I mean, even Locke, right? It was sort of funny, many people today who are Lockeans are anarchists, but, Locke's goal was to try to show that the state is in fact legitimate given his kind of libertarian, scheme of natural rights. And, he kind of reverse engineers his theory in various ways to try to get that result. And I think some of the moves he makes are pretty dubious in trying to do that. If he sort of could be convinced that they were dubious, maybe he would rethink some of his other more foundational commitments as well and be like, okay, I guess we have to, get rid of, property rights and my views about how legitimate states can come to be, because we need to show the state is legitimate. But yeah, I think that's going about things backwards. I'm like, no, we should start with the most plausible theory of legitimacy and then see where that takes us. that turns out, I think, to be the consent theory of legitimacy, and that takes us to the philosophical anarchist conclusion.
Yeah. So that seems pretty reasonable. So the next thing that I guess I want to push on is something that when I was reading the book, and I think this is something that really bothers me. When we're thinking about the kind of anarchist self-ownership position, it seems a little bit lax in certain ways. So you present this case of a guy like throwing bottles off a roof, and he just really likes throwing bottles off of roofs, right? Now it might be the case that sort of accidentally he hits somebody down on the street, and they apparently the people getting hit by the bottles, if indeed they do, don't seem to have a self ownership right against this because the guy's getting supplemental benefit by he just likes throwing bottles. Now
Right,
the
and we can even assume it's unique supplemental benefit, right? This is
right,
the
yeah,
only thing that will make him this happy, right?
yeah,
There's nothing else he could
right.
do.
And the response that you give is to say, yeah, that's kind of strange, but also people have distributive claims against that. I take it that if I get hit by like a bottle or whatever, I'm being made worse off through no fault of my own. I'm just trying to walk on the street, right? Um, so in one way, that seems okay. In another way, I sort of worry that the self ownership thesis just isn't doing anything anymore. I mean, consider that case, or even you coming around and I don't know, like murdering me, right? I mean, it seems like um, maybe I can make a sort of distributive claim there too, right? I mean, that's me being made worse off by no fault of my own. I sort of wonder if the self ownership theory is doing anything at that point.
Yeah, great, great. So I think the self-ownership theory sort of does a couple of things. Uh, One more ambitious and one more modest. So the more ambitious thing that it does is that, right, so sort of on my supersession model, right, so you become, we haven't really talked about this too much, but, in my view, like, you become a self-owner. You self-appropriate, you declare yourself, to be your property, and at that point, you sort of dissolve people's egalitarian claims over you, and you establish private property rights. Uh, this does a few useful things for you. Uh, One is that it does limit the sort of claims that other people have about what you do with your body, right? It's by dissolving the egalitarian claims, it's sort of, you you get certain permissions that you wouldn't otherwise have. You can now use your body, not other things, but you can at least use your body in ways that result in inequality, which is a pretty useful thing for people. Uh, More importantly, it will put certain constraints upon what can be done to realize equality. So there are going to be certain things that might get sort of be off the table, right? So for example, if I need a kidney, right, to live an equal life, if you only had luck egalitarian claims over your body, you would not have a claim against me coming and taking your kidney. Because you only have a claim against me using resources in a way that would leave you worse off through no fault of your own. But me taking your kidney wouldn't leave you worse off. It would equalize things. So the thought is that it gives you sort of that kind of claim against, against organ harvesting. And then I guess the sort of the weaker things I say, just more generally, right? We might think that one attractive thing about including sort of anarchist self-ownership gets you over and above distributive claims is that it provides a little bit of determinate structure to the claims we have that we might think is intuitively attractive, right? So one thing to note is that when I sort of my picture of which distributive claims people have is a little bit underspecified and underdetermined, right? So I just say, yeah, you have claims against other people using resources in a way that will leave you worse off through no fault of your own. But like, there's a lot of resources out there and like a lot of different ways to use them. So there's actually, I think, a lot of different ways that you could actually operationalize this constraint, right? There's many different right sets that would be compatible with this like sort of basic animating idea, right? maybe you have a claim against somebody using X, but not somebody using Y, or vice versa. Like it could equally be maybe you have a claim against people using Y but not X, right? Or using X half the time and Y half the time. Like there's lots of different ways that we might sort of structure assign people rights such that full compliance with them would lead everybody to live equally good lives. Sort of setting aside sanctionable choice, sanctionable choice adjusted equal quality lives. But then again, if you don't have self-ownership rights, right, like that could take the form of, maybe some people get to just have sex with you sometimes, right? That would be a possible, there's a way we could structure things where it's like, okay, yeah, some people get to have sex with you, but then you get to swim in the Beverly Hills mansion, and other people don't, right? You get that to yourself, or right? That would be compatible with, with my sort of a theory that only posited distributive claims. But we might think that's unattractive, right? We might think, no, that shouldn't, of all the different ways of assigning people sort of equal claim, rights to equality, other people should not have sort of permissions to have sex with you without your consent. And the anarchist self-ownership sort of ensures that that's the case. Without anarchist self-ownership, you don't necessarily get that. Egalitarian claims by themselves are fully compatible with people, using your body in all sorts of ways, just provided that you get, you have other rights that sort of compensate you such that you all end up, equally well off. Yeah, so that's, I think, the work they're doing. I mean, you're absolutely right that they're much less necessary than they would be, in a world without egalitarian claims, right? So if you're just sort of a strict libertarian, right, you definitely, and you don't countenance, my sort of posited egalitarian claims. You're like, yeah, the world's unowned, and then people just sort of establish private property. You really need self-ownership, right? Without self-ownership, people can just do anything to you, right? On my view, no, egalitarianism constrains already what people can do to you, but we still might want a little bit more, and that's, I think, what the anarchist self-ownership gets you. Yeah, great question.
Right. So maybe it's worth, maybe it speaks to how sort of complicated all of this is, because this is sort of important, I think, and we didn't even get to it. But there's one way of thinking about self-ownership where it's intrinsic, right? We're just people. We just have our bodies. They're ours. That's it. That's all there is to say. But that is actually not the position that you accept in the book. You think that I'm actually not sure how it's supposed to work, or to the extent that I do, I find it sort of strange. So the idea is that you sort of grow up and you get a relevant cognitive capacities and to be able to say things like, this is my body, right? And the idea is that just in virtue of saying something like "this is my body," that is just what it takes to be a self-owner. You claim yourself just in virtue of doing something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, so I think that pretty much sums it up, is right. The thought is you just acquire self-ownership in the way you would acquire any sort of other self-ownership, or not self-ownership, any sort of other ownership, right? So pick whatever your sort of favorite story is about how you acquire property, right? Mine's pretty thin. I think people can just, claim things. But, say you take a labor mixing view, right? Whatever it is. The thought is, yeah, you acquire ownership. Your body's just another bit of matter sitting out there, just like a tree or a field. And the thought is, yeah, you claim it by whatever, in the same way that you would anything else. You stake a claim or mix your labor, whatever. And you may have to make sure it satisfies the Lockean Proviso. And if you do that, well, now you come to own the thing. Yeah, and I sort of favor this. This is also sort of a heterodox view. I think there's one other libertarian who thinks this. Who was it? Maybe Stephen Kinsella. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But it's definitely a minority view. But I think it's attractive for a couple of reasons. Which is, first of all, it's much more sort of simple and parsimonious, right? There is something a little weird on a libertarian theory if you're like, okay, here's how you establish ownership of things, right? By mixing your labor and satisfying the Lockean Proviso. Oh, and you also own yourself, your body, in just the same way you own all these other things. But you just naturally own that, right? That that just comes to you. You don't have to sort of appropriate that. Everything else you have to appropriate, but not this thing. And to me, that seems a little ad hoc and arbitrary, right? Like, it's like, well, yeah, why is this thing so special? Like, why do you just come in with rights over this thing and like not other things, right? Why not think, and you could this could cut both ways, right? You might think, yeah, it'd be much more principled to think either like, I come in not owning my body and not owning anything else, and you have to appropriate everything. That's what I think. Or alternatively, you could be like, if I just come in with natural rights over my body, why not think I come in with natural rights over other things too? Is that like less intuitive? Not obviously, right? In fact, many people talk this way, especially kind of like left-leaning people are kind of like, oh yeah, and you have a right to food and a right to sort of, clean water. And, you might think, you could sort of tell a story where you're like, yeah, if you're at the point where we're just handing out, ownership over your body, why not just hand out, ownership over this bunch of food and this bit of water? So I think, yeah, there's, libertarians definitely don't like that, so they don't want to sort of countenance that. So instead they kind of go this like weird split view where it's like, oh yeah, you get your body, but not these other things. But I'm like, that seems to me arbitrary. So I think this is just a more consistent way of thinking about things. It's like, yeah, everything starts out unowned, and all of it comes to be owned in the exact same way. That's nice. It's elegant. It's simple. Yeah. So that's one advantage. Another thing I talk about in the book is that, another sort of worry you might have about natural sort of native self-ownership rights is you might worry that, like, well, what is it about people that ground, it seems like if people have native self-ownership rights, something has to ground these self-ownership rights. Like, there has to be some thing about somebody that gives them self-ownership. While, like, dogs don't have, it's like dogs and cats don't own themselves, but, like, people do. Well, why is that? Well, seemingly, right, on the native stories, it just has to be something about them. And the most sort of obvious candidate that I think most people would be drawn to is, it's like something about cognitive capacity. Hard to say exactly what. There's going to be a bunch of different views. But it's like, yeah, what makes me unlike a cat is that, like, I can do a lot with my brain that, like, a cat can't do. So that's why I get rights, self-ownership rights, and a cat doesn't. But then there's sort of a worry of, well, and this has been raised by numerous people, that if that's the ground of self-ownership rights, right? Well, it seems like there's a big spectrum in terms of like what cognitive capacities people have. So if somebody's like if cognitive capacities is what grounds self-ownership rights, why not think that like people who have a lot more cognitive capacity have much more robust self-ownership than people with less cognitive capacity? Seems like that's at least a natural thought. It seems a little bit arbitrary to be like, oh yeah, there's just some threshold above which you hit a degree of cognitive capacity that gives you self-ownership rights, and anything just one IQ point below that, or whatever you think, 1 point of sort of agency point below that, you lack these rights. Like, everybody above has the same rights, everybody below lacks these rights. There's at least something a little prima facie weird about that. Not impossible. Like, some things in the world work that way. Like, a classic example people give is like, water freezing, right? It's a range property where, above 0 degrees Celsius, every water is a liquid, and 100 degrees Celsius is a gas. Everything below 0 degrees Celsius, there's a huge range. It's all solid. Like, things sometimes work like that. But at least it's a little weird, and very often, if you've got sort of a scalar grounds for something, the thing is itself scalar, right? So that's sort of another bit of weirdness. But again, on my view, I'm like, well, I can sort of nicely solve this problem because I don't ground self-ownership in cognitive capacity per se. Rather, the reason that you come to own things is because there's just, the reason you own yourself is because there's a particular process that you can go through which you can come to own things, which is claiming things, asserting ownership over them. Now, and that's a nice principled line about like why cats and dogs don't own things. It's because they can't assert ownership. They don't have the relevant, sort of concepts. So as a result, they don't come to own themselves. So I think I can give it like a nice principled explanation about why people can own themselves in a way that like animals, plants, etc. can't, avoiding this sort of worry about, scalar, the scalar grounds, potential, opening the door to moral inequality, and also giving it like a nice parsimonious sort of explanation of ownership. So that's kind of the perks of my view, but it is heterodox for sure.
Um, right. That's interesting. I mean, definitely I have some thoughts about that, but I think there's just so much going on here. I better move on to something else. So as far as like the kind of the moral tyranny constraint, there are ways to push on that too.
Mm.
As plausible as it seems at first, one might worry that maybe it's sort of too strong. So, consider a case where I start a business and you start a business across the street, and your business beats my business out on the market. It seems like you could have done other things. You could have not started the business. It seems like you started your business without my consent. It seems to fulfill the conditions that we need to it seems to violate the moral tyranny constraint, basically, because when I lose my business, I'm left worse off, just sort of by stipulation, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, something as mundane as that seems to sort of violate the constraint.
Yeah, great. So I think that's a nice case, and the way that I sort of want to push back against that kind of worry is that I think you might think, okay, well, what's the real problem here? Uh, and I think the problem emerges if you construe the case in a particular way, which is you say, oh, well, it seems like now the moral tyranny constraint says that I can't have a moral sort of permission to start this business, right? If it turns out that my business will run, yours, or I guess in this case it's your business. In the case where it's your business, right? And you're a better business person than I am. You starting a business will run me out of business and leave me much worse off. Then you might think, okay, well, it seems like now the moral tyranny constraint says that a theory of rights can't give you a permission to start a business. I have to have a claim against you starting a business, or at least somebody has to have a claim, or maybe you have a non-directed duty, whatever, right? At the very least, you have a duty of some kind to not start a business. You have to, because otherwise you'd be able to choose to start a business or not, and then my fate would hang in the balance. And it seems like that's sort of an intolerable constraint upon your sort of natural freedom, right? Your options shouldn't come sort of pre-structured in that way. The way that I sort of then try to push back is I kind of say, okay, well, the moral tyranny constraint doesn't have to be committed to assigning duties in this particular way, right? It could still totally allow that you have a permission to go out and start your business. Now, if that then means that I end up very poor as a result, well, that just means, like, it's true now the correct moral theory can't sort of just countenance that and be like, okay, and that's how things end up. It has to do something, but it doesn't have to stop you from starting your business. What it does have to do is it has to sort of provide me with compensation, right? So if I poured, my savings into starting this business, and now you sort of have, you sort of run me out of business, well, the thought would be the moral tyranny constraint says other people have to have duties to sort of compensate me to offset this. Maybe everyone has to sort of, if I have a cost of X, everybody has, however many people there are, X over that number of people, they have to give that amount to me to offset that. So there might be compensatory duties instead, which I think is a lot less unattractive, right? It still allows for quite a bit of freedom. It just means that, it's like, so the kind of thought is people can do what they want. It just means that there are going to be duties for, people to pick up the tab afterward. Now, say that I'm like a really bad business person, right? And this was a really stupid thing for me to do and like pour my money into this business when like I'm bad at it and you're really good at it and I maybe knew you were going to enter the market anyway, but I kind of just do it anyway. Well, then the thought would be that, to sort of pull luck egalitarianism back into the conversation, right, would be that I've now made a sanctionable choice, right, by starting this business, right? I've done something, again, we haven't really talked about the exact details, but the intuitive idea suffices, right? I've done something sort of suitably imprudent such that actually now it would be just to leave me worse off, which actually corresponds with the moral tyranny constraint because the moral tyranny constraint sort of comes out of luck egalitarianism because the moral tyranny constraint says, yeah, you can't unilaterally leave me worse off. But if me being left worse off is sort of a function of both of our choices, right? Such that I sort of have just as much sort of say and control over that outcome as you do, right? So, I know that you're going to enter I know you're going to enter and going to be a better business person than I am. And nonetheless, I'm like, well, I'm going to try it anyway. The thought is, you leave me worse off, but it's not unilateral, right? I've played an important role, and thus there wouldn't necessarily have to be any duties to compensate me from anyone. Um, right? In fact, if there were duties for other people to compensate me, then that would be a way of me leaving other people worse off unilaterally. So the moral tyranny constraint sort of places this, I think, what's ultimately sort of a plausible constraint, right? If I'm a really prudent business person, and I kind of do everything right, I've got this great business idea, I come up with it. It just so happens I got unlucky, and you came up with it independently, and we both go into business, and you just get the upper hand, and I had no way of predicting that. It's kind of like I tried my best, right? The moral tyranny constraint says, yeah, people, you're free to start. I'm free to start my business. You're free to start your business. But now, and then everybody kind of has to pick up the tab for this sort of unfortunate situation where it turns out I made like kind of an unlucky choice, right? But if it turns out that, I made a really foolish choice by going into business and then, well, now the moral tyranny constraint says, yeah, that's just how things fall out. No problem. And I think that's actually a pretty attractive result. Yeah, so that's kind of how I, push back on those sort of concerns about freedom. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So when I was reading the response in the book, it's fairly technical. So laying it out like that is actually very helpful because I had trouble following it actually. So that's really great. Maybe one last thing here then. I think this is maybe a little bit disjointed from the way the rest of the conversation has gone, but I feel like it's a little bit thematically appropriate. So when we're thinking about, like a sort of rival view to everything that's been laid out here, there's this kind of very famous thought experiment by Robert Nozick, this Wilt Chamberlain thought experiment. And the way that we're thinking about, sort of what a just society would allow is basically just that it's when we have market transactions. So we have Wilt Chamberlain, this very, very talented basketball player, and everyone wants to see Wilt Chamberlain go play basketball. So we all pitch in whatever it is, 25 cents or whatever, to go see him play. And he ends up with millions and millions of dollars because we keep paying this money to go see him play. The thought is, how can we possibly object to that? These market transactions that seem to generate, especially in the long run, right, very, very high amounts of inequality. They're just the result of people's mundane choices. How can we possibly be, what's objectionable about that, right? That's basically the thought. So maybe it's helpful just before we go to sort of compare and contrast what's going on there with what you want to say about that case and what's different about what you think should go down there.
Yeah, great. So, I say a few, there's a lot to say about the Wilt Chamberlain case, and I say a lot of different things in the book, some of which are, I think, a little bit, take on the point a little bit less directly. So, like, one thing I say in the book is I'm kind of like, well, actually, my position, the anarchist position, is in some sense compatible with the Wilt Chamberlain case, because I want to say, well, in the Wilt Chamberlain case, right, if it's sort of, in my view, I think it sort of presupposes that people are entitled to a particular share of goods. In fact, I think that's sort of by design, right? In that, when Nozick was sort of crafting this thought experiment, he says, he sort of thinks in entitlement terms and says, oh yeah, suppose, pick your distribution of choice, like egalitarian, you egalitarian, you're an egalitarian, so you say each person gets this share. Well, now you're entitled to do what you want with it. Well, you each give 25 cents to Wilt Chamberlain. Now inequality's been upset. But it seems like, now a paradox has been reached, right? Because in your view, like, this was your share. You can do what you want with it. You want to give it to Wilt Chamberlain. But also shares have to be equal. And now they're unequal. So we've got a contradiction. So this is sort of a reductio of your view. But in my view, he's sort of presupposing that egalitarians think that you have this kind of entitlement, which I don't think egalitarians are necessarily committed to, right? I kind of think, oh, actually, they say that, they can just say, yeah, there's a just distribution, but that doesn't mean like you get you get some stuff, but just the stuff that kind of realizes, an egalitarian distribution. You don't get to do whatever you want with the stuff, right? You kind of get to use stuff in just the ways that, might lead you to be sort of, get you your kind of fair share of, utility or whatever it is that you think matters. So I do think he sort of presupposes entitlement. But in that case, I want to say, well, in my view, I can sort of grant to Nozick and say, yeah, people who, if you're entitled to your stuff, you can give it to Wilt Chamberlain. And there's no complaint, there's no justice-based complaint there. Right. But on my view, I'm just like, people aren't actually, so this kind of, I guess, gets more directly to my view, which is, on the story I tell, right, I'm saying people aren't really entitled to things in this way, right? They have these luck egalitarian claims over things, right? So, I might have claims against you coming in and using my toothbrush, but just insofar as that lets me live as good of a life as everybody else through no fault of my own. It doesn't mean that I can, give my toothbrush to somebody else and then have them have exclusive claim over it. So in some sense, there is some degree of tension here, right? Like Nozick does want to say that people have this kind of entitlement and this sort of discretionary control such that they can give their things to Wilt Chamberlain, and such that inequality can be created. Well, I kind of deny that, right? So maybe that's sort of the heart of the disagreement between me and Nozick really is he's like, yeah, people can sort of give their stuff away and change, they have the power to give other people new claims in a way that I'm a little bit reluctant to countenance. And now you might think, okay, well, why is my view more attractive? Because, yeah, Nozick's sort of thought is, he's like, yeah, who has a basis to complain in the Wilt Chamberlain case? But I think the answer there is, I don't know, maybe this is a little bit sort of pounding the table. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. But, in my view, I think it's sort of clear who has a complaint, which is that everybody has a complaint. Now, so suppose that I give 25 cents to Wilt Chamberlain, and then he ends up 25 cents richer than me. Well, then I have no basis for complaint, clearly, right? Because I'm like, yeah, I sort of knew that this would be the state. Like the state of affairs, like I fully countenanced it. I knew that he would be 25 cents richer than me if I make this decision. So, what basis do I have to complain? But if now you give 25 cents to Wilt Chamberlain, now he's 50 cents richer than me. Well, that's not what I signed on for, right? And I might think, well, I have grounds for complaint, that there's something unfair about this, right? Why should Wilt Chamberlain end up better off than me just because he's really good at basketball? Like, he's so much taller than me. I can't help that I'm, not even 6 feet, right? I never had a shot in the NBA. So, and you might think, well, yeah, it's why should Wilt Chamberlain get to live a better life than me through no fault of my own, right? When I didn't make that choice. So that's kind of my, so that what I think is the sort of egalitarian's basis for complaint is that, and maybe this kind of gets just to the foundations of the egalitarian outlook, right? Which is that, if there's difference between us, that needs to be justified, right? Somebody's living a better life than somebody else. That, at least I think for the egalitarian, demands some sort of justification. And it seems like, the fact that one person is much taller than the other person isn't a suitable justification for that. Right? The only thing that would sort of justify that is, me making sort of certain sorts of choices, whether that be like, sanctionable choices, giving the person the money, etc. So that's kind of my diagnosis of the Wilt Chamberlain case, is that if everybody gives Wilt Chamberlain a quarter, probably actually an inequality is just. The just state of affairs would be for Wilt Chamberlain to be 25 cents richer than all other persons. So, you kind of, I don't know exactly, you'd have to slice quarters pretty thin to kind of read, everybody gives him a quarter, you sort of redistribute all of it back, everybody ends up with, the total amount. I forget how much Nozick said he ended up with, like $1 million or something like that. You end up with you take $999,999.75 divided by the total number of people who aren't Wilt Chamberlain. That's what everybody gets. You all end up with like a little bit less than a quarter. and that would be just. So that's kind of, that's sort of concessive, but that would be my case against Wilt Chamberlain style inequalities.
Um, so I think I got to let you go. I really I want to ask you about
No,
paternalism.
go,
That was one of the
go.
things that bothered me too
Mhm.
was for all the moral tyranny constraint says it doesn't seem to bar paternalism, but obviously social anarchists are going to be very interested in not allowing paternalist sort of claims. So basically, the idea of paternalism is like if you know better than me, basically, you can sort of make me do things. Maybe one way to sort of push your intuition in that way is to say, if you're, I don't know, like a parent or whatever, and your kid doesn't want to get like a vaccine, well, you know better than they do, right? Paternalistically, you're going to make them go get the vaccine. Um, so the thought is, you're not leaving anyone worse off. In fact, paternalism, sort of by definition, you're trying to make them better off. But there are lots of cases where, maybe the vaccine thing is like okay, but there are lots of paternalistic cases that anarchists especially are really not going to be happy accepting. So there's this thought that I guess there's like a gap. Like for all the moral tyranny constraint says, we still have this gap of like what do we think about paternalism?
Yeah, great. So I think you've done a nice job of animating why we might think that the moral tyranny constraint is at least compatible with paternalism. But there's sort of an even stronger worry here, which is that you might actually think the moral tyranny constraint requires paternalism. The reason for this is like sort of weird, but think about it this way, right? So suppose that yeah, you're trying to get me to take a vaccine that will be very good for me, and I say no, I don't want to take it, and you might think, okay, suppose you have a moral theory that gives me a claim against paternalism. So I have a claim against you, jabbing me with the vaccine. In fact, as I posit, I do with anarchist self-ownership thesis. Uh, Now you might think, okay, now you face a choice. You can either stab me with the vaccine, contra, infringing upon my duty, or not. Well, if you don't stab me with the vaccine, I'll get pretty sick and, be pretty unhappy, right? So I'll end up pretty badly off. If you do stick me with the vaccine, I'll be much better off. Uh, and now further, right, in virtue of the fact that you've stuck me with the vaccine, you've also infringed my claim, the hypothetical posited claim against you sticking me with the vaccine. So it seems like you've now infringed one of my claims, and at least in many cases, when you infringe somebody's claims, you owe them some compensation, right? So and that's true even if maybe you leave them better off. There's some question here about exactly what duties of compensation are, but at least some people might think that, yeah, you owe somebody some compensation for strictly in virtue of infringing their claim, even if you didn't sort of harm them at all. It doesn't really matter, but suppose that's the case. Now you would have to, maybe pay me a little, like bake me an apology cake or something. Be like, sorry, I stuck you with the vaccine and give it to me. So now I'm actually, not only did I not get sick, I've also got your compensation on top of it. So it seems like I'm even better off. And so now the worry is, it seems like, well, you had this option, according to the positive moral theory, you were given a choice between leaving me very badly off by not involuntarily vaccinating me, or leaving me very well off by vaccinating me and compensating me as in addition. And so it seems like now that's an instance of moral tyranny, right? A moral theory shouldn't give you that kind of of discretion, right? It shouldn't be up to you how well off I end up. So that's sort of the worry. Is it seems like claims against paternalism are going to violate the moral tyranny constraint. But I think I've got a nice little clean solution to this, which is that, again, one of the features of the moral tyranny constraint is that it says, not just that you can't leave others worse off, but that you can't sort of foreseeably, unilaterally, and discretionarily leave other people worse off. And what I want to say is that when you do your duty, you're not acting discretionarily, right? You're sort of, in some sense, like there's a sense at least in which you have, if I have a claim against you vaccinating me, you have to refrain from vaccinating me, right? So that means that in some sense, this isn't really a choice that the moral theory gives you, right? It's not kind of like up to you what to do in the same way that, like, say strict egalitarianism leaves it up to you whether or not to destroy your stuff, right? Yeah, there's no, you have no duty to destroy or not destroy your stuff according to strict egalitarianism. You can do whatever you want, and then people have to pick up the tab if you make certain choices. But in this case, it's like, no, you have to do something, and that's not vaccinate me. So, therefore, you don't actually have this kind of discretionary choice according to the moral theory. So there's not going to be moral tyranny there. So that's what I want to say. Is at the very least, the moral tyranny constraint, it doesn't require paternalism, right? It's compatible with having duties against paternalism. I don't know that it necessarily gets you duties against paternalism. I'm actually not sure about that. I'd have to think a little bit more. I don't think I say anything about this in the book. Potentially those are compatible with the moral tyranny constraint, but I think there's other reasons for thinking, other independent reasons that aren't necessarily immediately derived from the moral tyranny constraint for thinking that, you have claims against paternalism. I mean, for example, most obviously, I think I'd appeal to something like, the anarchist self-ownership thesis, right? So it's going to say, yeah, that's the reason that you have a duty against against vaccinating me involuntarily isn't necessarily because that falls right out of the moral tyranny constraint, but rather because I've self-appropriated and now have claims against you sort of making contact with my body. Right, so that would be sort of the reason. And now, granted, maybe, anarchist self-ownership sort of fell out of the moral tyranny constraint like a ways back because it, comes out of, say, the Lockean Proviso, which in turn comes out of the moral tyranny constraint, but it's sort of an indirect path. But the sort of immediate grounds of the duty against paternalism is just going to be something like, the duty, the claim against paternalism, the duty to not engage in paternalist practices is going to be anarchist self-ownership rather than the moral tyranny constraint sort of immediately. Yeah, so that's kind of my comment on paternalism.
Sweet. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So it is about time, I reckon, that we wrap up. So I'll give you the floor. I mean, if you have some closing comments or anything you want to say.
Uh, I mean, not really. I mean, this has been a great discussion. I think you've done a really nice job of organizing it. Maybe, like I said, there's a lot going on in the book. It's like, it's very dense and it covers a lot of ground and has a lot of sort of pieces that all fit together in pretty intricate ways, which, has, I think, made the discussion, like, we've had to circle back a little bit and, like, lay, some of the groundwork for things that come earlier, came a little bit later, but, I think that's sort of inevitable when it comes to trying to present the material in this book. So yeah, I'm very grateful for you to have given me this opportunity. Yeah, and I hope people are who are similarly interested go and check it out. So yeah, thanks so much for giving me the chance to talk about it.